I'm Garima. I'm an assistant professor at University of New Mexico.
And I'm Alim Beveridge. I'm an assistant professor in organizational behavior at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China.
All of us are extremely interested in impact that businesses have on society and the environment. So we're always looking for interesting data sets and interesting contexts in which we can actually understand how do businesses make impact. And benefit corporations, or B Corps, is a growing movement where these organizations are focusing on purpose and profit. So what do they really do is that they go to an independent third party called B Lab, and B Lab gives them an assessment on their environmental, social, and governance practices. And the organizations that get certain number of points become certified B Corp or benefit corporations. So we were interested in how much this movement has grown. It's about 2,600 certified B Corps across 60 countries in the world, and they're adding more and more every day. And we thought it's such a fertile ground for really understanding how an organization decides which practices to focus on and how do they actually engage with that practice to really create social and environmental impact.
The quantitative data was actually provided to us by B Lab, which is the organization that is heading the B Corp movement and is also the certifier and the assessor. So they made data from two waves of the assessment available to academics such as us, and so we took opportunity of that, and we analyzed the data to look for profiles. So we didn't want to just consider individual practices, but wanted to see whether these practices come in bundles or configurations where they appear together commonly. And we found, in fact, that there are such configurations or profiles where some organizations might be much more focused on the natural environment, such as reducing their use of hazardous materials, than other organizations that don't have that same profile. So we found that these profiles exist, and we also found that these profiles, even though they change, they're stable. So an organization will have the same profile over time, even though things are changing. And so we concluded that rather than making changes to individual practices, organizations are actually making changes to these configurations or profiles.
This is answering our question whether organizations change their practices from one assessment to another. We were also very interested on how do they decide which practice to change, what's going on outside the organization, inside the organization, what we call in academia mechanisms. What are the mechanisms through which these organizations decide how they would change their practices? So to do that, we actually went and spoke with B Corp leaders and said, this is what we're observing, that there is a change in practices. Tell us, how do you decide whether to change? And really getting those narratives and stories from them, from the sense like, you received this assessment, now what do you do in terms of deciding what to change, when to change, and how. So we found some interesting patterns there too. Actually, the nature of practices makes a lot of difference in how an organization decides. And there are two kinds of natures of practices. One is what we're calling the low-hanging fruit. So questions or practices like write a supplier policy, so everyone will want to change that because it's low cost, low resource, low time. So there's a low-hanging fruit nature of practices. And the other more, I think interestingly, we found that what we're calling the latitude of interpretation, whether the language used in the practice allow them to interpret the practice in their own unique way. So here's an example. It would ask what percentage of renewable energy do you use in your manufacturing process? Now, renewable energy is a big bucket, So intentionally, this assessing organization have introduced some sort of latitude for the organization to interpret that practices. So we also found a consistent pattern where practices which had some latitude of interpretation were changed.
I think the big one, interesting one, is that we did see an overall improvement because we had two waves, right? So two different time points, and we did see that those organizations that had done the assessment at time 1 and at time 2 were showing improvement over time. So that's a good sign that organizations that assess their practices actually make improvements to those practices. That's a good sign. We also saw there were a few practices where there was actually decline over time. So not everything was being improved, but overall the picture was one of improvement. So one of the implications of our findings is that you change based on who you consider to be your peers as an organization. So that may mean that you pay attention to certain things and improve them, which is great, because you notice that others that you're comparing yourself to are improving them or are better than you in those areas. But it also may mean that you ignore certain areas, and that could be the weakness. And so one implication or one message to organizations that are trying to improve their social and environmental impact is to be careful who you compare yourself to, because it shows you certain things but also creates certain blind spots.
I think for us it's there has been sort of interest from the benefit corporation community, which I haven't experienced in other studies. So I think it's a good example of finding a question or a research project where there is already an existing interest in practice. So they're willing to work with you, they're willing to provide you data, they're willing to talk to you, and they're interested in your findings. So I think to us that was very generative.